Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest issue of the ESG Show. And today we're talking about ISSB. All things to do with ISSB. It's a topic we discussed before, but it's an important topic, so I'm quite pleased that we're discussing it again. Before we kick off, I'm going to tell you about a survey that we did. But before I tell you about the survey, I'll tell you about the survey now. We asked, what do you think is the key benefit to the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, for new businesses? And the answers were, as you can see from the diagram, that clarity and consistency got 50% of the votes. Long-term sustainability got 33% of the votes. And enhanced credibility and access to capital tied at third place each, both with 8% of the votes. We had one comment from Eric Villapro who said, none until they embrace double materiality. And so thank you for that, Eric. Thank you for your comment about double materiality. That has stoked a little bit of conversation with our guests this morning. So we will be discussing double materiality shortly. And I'm assured that it's got nothing to do with a physics paper on black holes, but then actually has some other meaning. So let's find out about that shortly. Before we kick off and I introduce you to the guests, just to let you know that this is episode 22 of the ESG Show. I've actually lost count. Never been particularly good at counting beyond 20, but I think it's 22. And hope you're enjoying it. We've now reached that stage when we think, well, we think we've got a formula that works quite well. We want to beef it up. We want to make the show better than ever. And that costs money, of course. So if you're interested in partnering this, if you think there's a synergy between what you're doing and what we're doing, and you'd like to work with us, then please contact me on michael.baxter@techopian.com. Now it is time to meet our guests. And today we're doing things a little bit differently. In addition to we've got two guests on the show today, but one of our guests interviewed a CFO, a Chief Financial Officer, a few days ago, specifically for the ESG Show, and we'll be running that as well. And that interview will be occurring in about 25 minutes' time. Excuse me. And today, from Down Under, I'm being joined by David Upton. Hello, David. I was going to say good morning, but it's not good morning where you are. What's the time where you are?
It's 9 p.m. here.
9 p.m. and it's 11 a.m. here. And where are you? Whereabouts are you right now?
I'm in Melbourne, where it's currently raining and about 12 degrees.
12 degrees and raining. I thought the weather was always hot in Australia. Okay, so David Upton is the co-founder of Getting to Zero, a consultancy that helps provide organizations measure, disclose, and reduce emissions. With over 20 years' experience in transforming companies with enterprise analytics and planning, David helps companies develop the data capability to address regulatory demands, automatic carbon counting, and build strategies to decarbonize. I will be speaking to David again shortly, and David will also be speaking to Mark Hogan, who's a Chief Financial Officer of Carpet Court, a mid-cap Australian retailer, on how ISSB will impact organisations, boards, and finance teams, along with new capabilities they must develop. So I'm looking forward to that, David. How are things in Australia at the moment? How's net zero coming along in Oz?
Oh, it's an interesting topic, Michael, and time permitting, I might drop one or two examples later in the show.
Okay, I look forward to that. Thank you, David, and I'll be speaking to you in just a few minutes. Now I'd like to introduce Kristi Heiman. Hello, Kristi.
Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, and it really is morning where you are. What's the time where you are?
It is 6 o'clock here in Boston.
So we've really got the globe covered today. 6 o'clock in the morning, 9 p.m. And for me, it's a nice civilized 11 a.m. So I do put my guests through it every week. So Kristi Heiman is the Vice President of Net Impact Montreal. She became involved in sustainability shortly after she finished law school. Rather than taking the conventional legal path, Kristi applied her analytical tools in environmental issues while interning for a small non-profit dedicated to empowering small businesses nestled along coastal areas to adopt sustainable practices, and an emerging grassroots association near Boston. Her interest in green technology and finance started after volunteering at 2 environmental organisations in Montreal during a 1-month French immersion course in 2018. Kristi's areas of focus are ESG investing and sustainability standards. So, Kristi, does ESG investing and sustainability standards, how much do they overlap?
I think they really do overlap. And according to the report that you sent me, there's really, I think, an overlap. And with the hiring of Linda Fisher of DuPont, we're seeing really a lot of creating values through ESG goals, stakeholder management, and also building an ESG strategy. But I think really the crux is bringing the shareholders together, stakeholders together. We always think of the shareholders as the bottom line, but we have to think of the whole picture. Who are the people that are being affected, the communities and the environment that are being affected by the operations of the business, but also too, it also includes the employees. It's really bringing the enthusiasm of ESG to the employees and see how they can make their own impact as well. So really, and also too, brings forth to the communications by engaging, informing, and education, stakeholder expectations, and also inspiring ESG by trying to improve data sets. But I think that's all what it is. It's really more than just the stakeholders. It's just bringing everyone in the community.
Okay, thank you for that, Kristi. We're now in that part of the show when we have a look at some recent editorial or reports that are out there. And we kick off with a recent piece on ESG Today, which headlines: SEC Chair says climate disclosure rule feedback pushes back on Scope 9 reporting as less developed, unreliable. I think I'm going to read that again. It's a bit of a mouthful. SEC Chair says climate disclosure rule feedback pushes back on Scope 3 reporting as less developed and unreliable. So, David, what's all this about?
Well, Michael. So, on one level, it's about greenhouse gas reporting, specifically for US entities. The SEC, or the Security and Exchanges Commission, are currently working through about 16,000 comments on their proposed disclosure rules. So these are they're going to serve a similar purpose once they're enacted to the ISSB that we're discussing today. But this article suggests that the SEC may soften their requirement around Scope 3 to address concerns that public companies might place pressure on private companies and even small business who are their suppliers to collect and share emissions data. And all of those other businesses, the small businesses, they're not the target of the SEC. So that's the crux of the article. And certainly, while there are some complexities around Scope 3, and time permitting, perhaps we can discuss these later more in the show, it is good to remember that it's not all about pressure, it's also about collaboration. And there are certainly ways that you can use data to focus efforts where they have the greatest impact. And in that way, there is an opportunity that the impacts grow like a snowball. So time permitting, it'd be great to discuss this later on.
I think that'd be really interesting, very much so. Sorry, did you want to come in there, Kristi?
It's kind of strange because really with the SEC, they go by their own standards. So they, but I think right now it's just going to be a very debatable topic here in the United States.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got another article. I don't know if article is the right word, actually. I don't know what the right word is. It's a report from Ipsos. And it states, established in 2023, the Ipsos ESG Council brings together senior level executives with responsibility for sustainability and development of ESG best practice from some of the most respected corporations in the world. So it's a document more than an article, really, about the Ipsos ESG Council. Kristi, what are your thoughts about this? Can you expand on what this is about?
It really, I think, goes beyond the role of a chief conservative officer. It really shines a light because it really brings, I think, ESG to the forefront. How it's really bringing ESG as fundamental to the business. It's not really a vacuum where there is just a little department. It's actually part of the C-suite, and I think it's really going to change the way businesses will look at ESG as being a vital part of taking part of being environmental stewards.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. We just had a comment related to the previous article that we were talking about, the one about SEG chair says climate disclosure rule feedback pushes back on scope 3 reporting as less developed. And Christopher Bullock said, yes, we need to think of ESG as a logical process. When you break it down into silos, E, S, and G, you can better understand how each element impacts each other in corporate and natural ecosystems. And whilst I've got both you, Kristi, and you, David, here, can we turn to the topic of double materiality? Kristi, can you explain briefly your understanding of double materiality?
Sure, and I think let me start by what is materiality by the former Chief Justice Thurgood Marshall. A substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider the information important in deciding to vote how to make an important investment decision. So really what double materiality, it's a concept that came out of the EU in the recent years, is looking how it goes beyond how it impacts the bottom line for a company. It goes beyond how are we impacting the environment. So really, it's an extension of the key accounting concept of materiality and financial information. But there's a lot of debate of what is an acceptable definition of double materiality. So the answer really depends on one's view on the environmental impacts in the first place. But so just think, I look at it as a cycle of a company's impact on the environment and how the impact on the environment is reflected back. But it's a very, very, but it does matter because it helps to inform opinions on the free functioning markets. It's a market dynamic, and also it affects corporate management for disclosure requirements and how it affects corporate behavior.
Okay, thank you for that. When you were talking just then, I just suddenly had this thought flash in my mind of two mirrors facing each other. Maybe there's a parallel with that, I think, possibly. Yes. David, have you got anything to expand upon that?
Yeah, I mean, Kristi made a very salient point that, if you think of IFRS, traditional financial reporting, the primary stakeholders are really investors and lenders. They're the people who read financial statements. They're the stakeholders. So the new ISSB standards also consider materiality really from the same kind of lens, from the potential effect inward on the enterprise value, rather than looking at impact materiality, which looks outwards. There is a case that there is some overlap between those concepts, though, that Kristi touched on. In fact, that outward impacts can eventually work their way inwards in organization. And I was just thinking about that. If we took an example like, I don't know, turbocharging opiate sales, they impact the community. Eventually, the company's at risk of class action, for example, or maybe there's unsustainable water consumption that impacts biodiversity. Eventually, it runs dry. These types of things eventually have a financial impact on the company. And so you get this idea that externalities get internalized. But I guess the problem could be that in the meantime, it could be convenient for a company to kind of quietly ignore them until that time.
Okay, I think I'm getting there. Right. Thank you for that, David. We've just had a couple more comments. We've had another comment from Christopher Bullock, who spoke earlier. He said, when we talk about stakeholders, we need to consider non-breathing participants that we all rely on and consider planetary boundaries. I don't know whether either of you have any thoughts about what Christopher said there. If so, please speak.
Maybe I could touch on that. I don't know if this will answer Christopher's question, but our president has started a project called Polyaction, which is to reintroduce natural species in Montreal to pollinate, gardens, maybe other, open areas. So maybe that could be an example of what he is touching on.
When you say our president, are you talking about Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden here?
No, I'm talking about our president of Net Impact Montreal. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. President of your company. I gave you two choices and neither of them were right. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, and then David, have you got anything to add at all before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you talk about double materiality, you can the world's your oyster in terms of who are the stakeholders that you consider in that. I guess just back in the context of what we're talking about today, the ISSB standards, I mean, they've grown up from IFRS, the organization that produced financial reporting standards. That actually started, I think the first one came out in about 2003, IFRS 1, and now we're up to IFRS 17, and they continue to expand the scope and clarify and refine aspects of financial reporting. So I think it's quite plausible, over time that we'll see an evolution or an extension of the two initial IFRS S1 and S2 standards that we're talking about today, perhaps working with the likes of the Global Reporting Initiative to provide that more holistic picture of enterprise value and impact. So don't judge, I guess, what they'll do in 10 years by what's just been released on day one at the moment.
Okay, fair enough. We've also had a comment from Delwyn Longdon. We use the SDGs as the principal framework and ESG as a process across all parts of the business. Anyway, so thank you for that. I'm now going to be having a short conversation with David, and we're going to drill a little bit further into ISSB. So David, what are the standards then?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, we've been talking a lot about them. So the ISSB, that's the International Sustainability Standards Board, released two disclosure frameworks, S1, which is around general sustainability, and S2, which was specifically around the climate, back in June of this year.
Okay, so general sustainability related and climate related.
Yeah.
And so who's making these standards?
So ISSB is sort of underneath the umbrella organization of IFRS. That's the International Financial Reporting Standards. They're already used from a financial perspective, financial reporting, by around 170 countries. When they came out, as I mentioned, since the early 2000s, they brought much needed consistency to financial reporting. And now really they're doing a similar thing from a sustainability perspective. The IFRS is one of the big three. We touched on them at the beginning. The SEC are producing one for US entities. And then you've got EFRAG in the EU, which is covering that sort of double or impact materiality that we discussed briefly before as well.
Okay, so that's IFRS, SEC, and what was the EU one?
EFRAG.
EFRAG. Gosh, yeah, we've got a lot of acronyms floating around, haven't we? Okay, so why are they being introduced?
Well, 3 reasons. Number 1 is about alignment, aligning sustainability with financial reporting. You have to produce it at the same time or even in the same pack each year. Number 2 is about transparency. So that's to make it more transparent for capital markets and for investors, making it easier for them to compare sustainability reporting along the value chain. And in some respects, it's addressing, I guess, a criticism in ESG of what they've called the alphabet soup of different standards by trying to put a flagpole in the sand and say, these are standards that you can adopt. And the third reason is around impact. It's really about addressing an urgent need for action. It's sort of driving organizations, I guess, from a compliance perspective, to manage and respond to risks and opportunities and grow more sustainably.
Okay, thank you for that. So alphabet soup, yes, I'd agree with you there. IFRS, SEC, EFRAG. You could all, I do Wordle every day, and it's just a shame you can't use some of these things in Wordle, because I think I could do rather well there. How will companies need to disclose?
Yeah, that's a good one. So it's going to be in the annual reporting process. It's got to be in sync with their financial reporting process. And that's one of the big reasons why we're talking to a CFO later on, because there is that overlap and a connection with finance teams, especially in mid-cap organizations. But primarily, there are 4 sections of what they'll need to disclose. There's governance. So it could be your structure. Here's your sustainability, your finance team, your board, your exco, your business heads, how you're dealing with governance around sustainability. There's a strategy perspective. So this could be your transition plan. There's a risk management process. This could include things like scenario analysis. And finally, there's the metrics and targets. So these metrics could just be simply explaining the metrics you've used for your strategy and risk management. What metrics are you using there? Obviously, it's going to include things like your greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 to 3. But it could also include those specific organizational targets. They could be sector-based standards. That's out of scope of today's discussion, but from SASPA. And it could be about how that organization's tracking against those targets.
Okay, so thank you for that. And then when will all this become mandatory, do you think?
Yep. Well, the time frame does vary country by country. So to make it easy, I'm just going to pick Australia. It's indicative because each jurisdiction can tailor the standards to as they need. So during the year 2024, it will impact larger entities. They're around $500 million in revenue. And this staged rollout will continue until 2027, when the small entities, they're right down to $50 million in revenue, will need to start reporting. So it's a really big change. It's a big impact, especially on mid-cap and mid-sized organizations, the ones that don't traditionally have sustainability teams. It might drive extra requirements for the finance teams, for the CFOs. And companies are certainly going to need to start invest in building capability. That's even potentially new technology or analytics to be able to deal with that. And, one of the implications could be that over time, companies might start to shift the way they perceive and manage risk, and run certain of those key processes around strategic and operational planning. But really, in that mid-cap space, it's the first time that many organizations will seriously be considering this.
Okay, thank you for that, David. David, while I've still got you here, we've had another comment from Eric, who was the one that initially raised the point about double materiality. And he's offered a view, in his humble opinion. Difficult to listen quietly. People advocating for single materiality, ESRS, will spread surely like GDPR is doing. Any thoughts on the comment there?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can argue. I think it'd be good to have Kristi back for this bit too. We could pick it up later on, because double materiality, certainly there's a broader definition of what the impact of a company is doing. Traditional financial reporting hasn't considered it. So just getting those entities to start having to report on sustainability issues in the first place is a big jump. We don't need to stop there. But given there's already a huge jump for many organizations to start addressing this, to add in a more, I guess, as you described, Kristi, a term that could be potentially more subjectively assessed by an organization, could kind of confound or complicate the rollout of this.
I think one thing that can help bring clarity to double materiality is bringing the role of stakeholders, the people who are directly the actors who are directly affected by by the actions of the company. If they can include stakeholders in, I think it could really flesh out any ambiguities with double materiality. Also inject in the ISSB standards to really give a full picture. With accounting and finance, we tend to be very narrow-minded and we look at the bottom line. But I think we have to expand our horizon. And really, this is a very, very fruitful, this is a wonderful opportunity to really be innovative and creative and really kind of synergize what business and what the world does. We have to look at that. I mean, look at the CFA Institute. They have ESG certificates. They're including that more into their programs. And for the CFA Institute to institute these ideas, I think it's a really big step, and I think hopefully that will, start a precedent.
Okay, thank you for that. We've had another comment from Christopher. We know that there are many sustainability issues that need addressing. When you think that the global financial standards are still being reformed for alignment, 2001, ISAB replacing IASC, what chance has ESG on a global basis? Either of you, any thoughts on that one? Okay. Well, we'll chew that one over, and maybe we'll get some more discussion on that point in the chat. And Martin says, next to mandatory ESG KPIs with predefined thresholds, we should give the choice between single and double materiality. I think we've discussed that already, but if you have anything to add on it, please speak. Okay. Now I'm going to be chatting to Kristi for a short while, and I'll see you again shortly, David. Kristi, so why are synchronous ESG standards important, do you think?
Well, first of all, solve consistency issues. We see all the differences in sustainability standards across the world. There are so many acronyms that are flying out there. And it will actually it will improve benchmarking across the sectors and in the industries, but also will bring a common language for a set of definitions, so more into a digital taxonomy. And also, too, it's very much favored with leaders from across the world, especially with the developing countries. I mean, I know leaders from Africa really are embracing changes to help them develop their economies as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And what are the challenges to enforce these standards, do you think?
Well, I think the first challenge is really the data. There's such a data gap on getting high quality data information regularly right now. Issues with dealing with companies to comply from many parts of their business with risk management, HR, operations, legal, and these standards can help aggregate this data as well.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question, which is, so David has given us sort of an Australian perspective. So what are the positions in Canada and the US at the moment?
Well, right now, Canada is really embracing the ISSB, the standards. It's one of the first signatories to the ISSB, along with New Zealand, South Korea. Also, too, it directly affected Net Impact Montreal, as the Canadian Standards Sustainability Board actually reached out to us to do a consultation in late July to get our feedbacks on how it can be improved. However, in the United States, as we touched on earlier, it's going to be a little bit more thorny, as with the SEC, with their contention with scope 3, and also 2, we also follow the gap accounting principle. So especially now with the presidential election coming up next year, I think it's really something more we have to see more for in the timeline.
Okay, thank you for that, Kristi. Now we're getting lots of questions coming through. We've got another question from Christopher, Mohammed, Delwyn, Lana Adamson. We're going to be dealing with all those questions shortly, but I think now it's the point to turn to the interview that David conducted last week. We thought it'd be a very good idea to get the perspective from a chief financial officer. And Mark Hogan is the chief financial officer for a mid-cap retailer called Carpet Court, which has got over 250 stores across Australia. Mark has over 20 years of experience in senior finance roles across retail, wholesale and logistics sectors. And he has been instrumental in addressing new regulatory reporting from IFRS for financial reporting. In this interview, Mark and David discuss how ISSB will impact organisations, boards and finance teams, along with new capabilities that they must develop. And that video interview will be following in just a second, hopefully.
Mark, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
Yeah. On this week's show, we're discussing the new ISSB reporting standards, the ones that connect sustainability and financial disclosures, and that's a really big change. So I have a couple of questions for you as a CFO, and the first one really is that when a company doesn't have, especially mid-sized organizations, don't have a dedicated sustainability team in place, could the CFO be the new CSO?
I think, particularly when you're thinking about mid-market organisations and the depth of capability and resources really across the business, I think you're probably right. It doesn't naturally sit with the CFO, particularly when you think about the volume of data collection going to be required over time. And the CFO has generally been, at the centre of that whenever those sort of activities have had to be rolled across a group. How they roll up financial numbers now, it's not a huge step to the right. I do think that will probably happen in the initial stages, though. I think as time goes on and we move further into sustainability as a capability in an organisation, it will devolve out into other roles because it can't sustainability is not something that can just fall on one particular function. I don't think at an organisational level it needs to sit within each function because everybody plays a role. But I think in the initial stages, definitely it will probably most likely fall within the finance function.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And what type of capabilities do you see that you might need to develop in the finance function?
I think, it's certainly at our early stages of kind of peering over the fence as to what might be required. I think, it's certainly at our early stages of kind of peering over the fence as to what might be required. If you're thinking about the different types of data that we're actually going to need to roll into and get our heads around it, you're almost looking at a kind of data scientist type capability to be able to pull that type of information together, because it may not be coming from sources that are as readily available as core financial systems. So there's going to be some real challenges in that space. Very, very. If you think about the core finance team at the moment, definitely shifting up the analytical curve in terms of interpreting different sets of numbers and problem solving as well, because there's going to be a lot of challenges as we move into this space, finding pieces of information, interpreting information, so problem solving, and a different style of collaboration as well, I think. So without that, because they're going to need to, finance team, if they take on this broader role, they're going to need to have tentacles into every part of the organisation and potentially outside. So it's going to bring a different level of collaboration, I think, for finance teams.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, you mentioned something there that's quite interesting about maybe a data scientist or getting your hands on a lot more information. I mean, do you think that you can, just take your existing internal and external reporting processes, the technology that you're using, and simply enhance that? Or do you think that you might end up developing, needing new technology, for example, and completely new processes to support this type of thing?
I think ultimately you're probably going to end up in a space where there will be new technology, but given like the speed and pace of change that is, kicked off with the advent of some of the large language model stuff and AI more broadly over the last 12 months, I definitely think there'll be new technology to assist us. So, you'll have finance teams are going to have to jump on board and capture that wave or ride that wave of new technology coming through. I don't think existing financial systems will be capable in the first sort of phase of it all, but I suspect your larger financial systems, ERP type systems, and companies out there will be thinking about this at the moment and how they build it into core platforms. Whether it goes all the way, or whether smaller operators, startups are able to move more nimbly and more quickly into this space. Could be one of the ways it plays out.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. And obviously, this whole focus is around this external reporting and this disclosure. But I mean, if you think, you mentioned, for example, a whole new level of collaboration required. If you think beyond just the external disclosures, what are some of the potentially deeper organizational changes that this could drive?
I think if you think about it, from the top down, and structure of the board and bring the board on the journey, with the organisation in this change, it's a very, very significant change, and making sure that they, understand their roles and responsibilities, in the context of these changes as they come through. And then taking the broader organisation on that journey as well. It's going to be pretty challenging. I think I think for finance teams, I think it will be slightly easier to deal with because of, they to a certain extent, they've been through a lot of these changes over the last 20 years with IFRS and all those changes that were brought through. But taking an entire organisation on the journey is really, really tough.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned boards, for example. I mean, most organizations already have, a risk register, a risk matrix, they consider risk, but it's kind of a whole new class of risks that organizations are potentially considering that it's just not been part of their thinking up to this point. So
yeah, particularly in the mid-market, I think, if you think about the top 200 ASX or S&P 500, I mean, those larger, very sophisticated organizations have probably been contemplating this for some time. And albeit maybe moving slowly, they have a momentum about them through this change.
Yeah.
When you come down to mid-markets who may have an informal board or a more family-oriented governance structure, to then wrap your head around some of the changes that are coming in this space, it's going to take quite a bit of potentially external support if they don't have it internally. And that's where, finance teams will ultimately play that role to help them drive that through and bring it together. But it's going to take, quite a bit of change in those organisations because it's a big leap.
Yeah. I mean, you could even, if you think about your traditional strategic planning process, how far you look out, even your operational planning process. I mean, it's not all about risk. Obviously, there's potential opportunities, decarbonizing, for example, bring cost savings. You might find new products or services to bring to market, and possibly projecting that forward, quantifying the financial impact. So, yeah, I mean, it could lead to potentially, different ways of planning, for example, for the organization.
Well, I think if you're looking at, the way typically most organizations work now, even in that mid-market level, planning out 3 to 5 years, and may end up, looking further afield because the investments that are being made will be longer term investments. I think probably the harder, depending on, which category or which business line you're in, the more challenging one from a consumer perspective and understanding exactly where the consumer is at in looking at sustainable products and, looking at like-for-like products, one being a sustainable product and one not, and the potential price premiums. That's a real challenge at the moment when you're looking forward and understanding, your mix of products that you're thinking about bringing to market and sustainable or otherwise. Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge for finance teams and boards to get their head around too, and how you make that transition to the new world.
Yeah. There's some really good points there. Well, thanks very much.
Well, that seemed to have frozen just at the end there, so we missed the bit with David saying thank you. But perhaps David, you could say thank you to Mark on my behalf and on behalf of everybody watching the show today. We've had so many questions have come through, and I'm going to go through them. I'm not going to go through them in a logical order. I'm going to go through them in the order that I've received them. So there's a possibility that we might be asking a question and then another question, and then another question, which might be quite similar to the previous one. So apologies if that happens, but I'm going to go through them in the order that I'm looking at them because my brain isn't big enough to put them in a logical order on the fly, as it were. And Mohammed asked, can you illustrate more on the interrelations between risk management and materiality assessment approach? Can both be managed by the same department or same perspective? Any thoughts about that, you two, either of you?
I can try and start if you like. Kristi, and you can
Yeah.
pick me up if I start to flounder. All right. So, I mean, this materiality, Michael, frankly, I think you could do a whole show just on that. It's
I
obviously.
think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. Are there any materiality experts out there listening to this show? Do get in contact. We might ask you to come on the show.
Yeah. So I suppose just to keep it simple for a moment, and I'm sure that will inspire some comments. If you just take the kind of classic internal materiality enterprise value perspective, it's about the financial impact. And that's kind of the traditional lens that risk managers have used when assessing risk for the organization. I think the difference, if you look at the ISSB, is that they have to look at a broader palette of potential risks about the environment, about supply chain resilience, about extreme climate events, about a whole range of issues that previously have just not been something that they've considered. So the risk concept is the same. It's just it's expanded the scope in terms of what they're focusing on and need to report on.
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, did I interrupt you there, Kristi? Were you going to say something, or did I?
I think it was explained very eloquently. Yeah.
Indeed. So Christopher has made another comment. I think it's your third comment, I think, this morning, Christopher. Although you've already had a thumbs up from one of our other viewers, Scott, who congratulated you on your earlier questions. There's a lot of noise around the pros and cons of so many ESG frameworks. However, does the number of ESG frameworks make it easier for companies to hide the reality of their behavior? I suppose it's kind of hiding behind complexity sort of question, really. Is that a risk, do you think?
I think there's always a risk of greenwashing, manipulating the information. So, I mean, that's, I think you will, hopefully these standards will minimize it, but with human nature, there's always going to be some deviation of it.
Okay. Thank you. Derwin has made another comment. I hope I pronounced your name, Derwin. You've commented twice, so that hopefully means that I have pronounced it correctly. With the panel, where do the SDGs sit? Any thoughts about that? Where do SDGs sit?
I suppose it's probably worth just to clarify what the panel reflects in this. Does it mean the ISSB, for example, who are defining the standards, or internally?
Okay, so Lana Adamson, one thing that has not been touched on here is the essential expanding of the time horizons. The 4-year cycle is a combative point for delivering sustainability. Timeframes, any thoughts about that, about 4-year cycle?
Well, it is actually, in relation to the IFRS S1 and S2 standards, is that, when you're looking at scenario analysis, which is definitely part of the strategic planning process, as well as, the risk management, is that companies will need to conduct scenario analysis over longer timeframes. So these could be 5, 10, 15-year time horizons. So you're absolutely right that, because the impacts of, say, unsustainable activities aren't necessarily felt for a long time, when you've got a short-term focus, that this definitely can impact that. But one of the potential upsides of the ISSB is that it could, regardless of, say, political cycles, it could push companies to be considering scenarios from longer timeframes.
Okay, thank you. We've had another comment from Eric. What will be the strategies of the companies outside the EU that will have a regulatory compliance to report as per the EU ESRS? I don't know if you understand that question. If you do, please have a go at answering it.
Yeah. My conjecture is that it's that situation where maybe they need to do single materiality in one jurisdiction and then the double materiality in the EU. And I think that concept is, even if you just take the ISSB, if you've got a multinational and they need to, say they're in Australia and Singapore and Japan, and each of those jurisdictions tailors their standards, they'll need to work to avoid duplicate effort. That might be things like common data platforms or technology. They'll also need to ensure reporting in one region probably meets the requirements in another. So that's a great question, how companies go on addressing that. Some may elect to report the double materiality everywhere, for example. Others may do it specifically to meet those EU requirements.
Michael, I'm just looking at some of the questions from Jason and Christopher about the SMGs.
Yeah.
What they can do is I'm not sure the size of what they're referring to, but small companies can actually start by measuring GHG emissions with using platforms that are available. Say, for instance, there is Spectrite, what they can do. So even though probably these standards are applicable to multinational corporations, but these companies can start just focusing on their own, and making something for their clients and customers and their communities.
Okay, thank you for that, Kristi. So to be clear, Kristi was referring to a point made by Christopher, who said the majority of ESG commentary tends to focus on bigger corporations. However, it is interesting to think that 99.9% of companies in the UK are SMEs, and I would imagine that's a similar proportion globally. Is it similar in Australia? I'd imagine, David. I would imagine there's a significant percentage of Australian businesses are SMEs.
Yep. I think it's like 97% are small and medium, and it's a very high proportion. I think it's the same everywhere. Yeah.
And then James Cameron, the other James Cameron, I assume. Maybe it's the other. Maybe it's I don't know. It might be the Titanic James Cameron. Probably not. He said, "What type of platforms are popular for SMB?" So I think Kristi's had a go at answering those two questions. David, have any thoughts on those two questions?
So on that question specifically, I mean, this is there are multiple approaches there. So as Kristi mentioned, there are cloud-based reporting platforms that are purpose-built. The plus side is that they can include standard disclosure formats. They might have consulting teams that bring subject matter expertise, and they range really from big entities like the Microsoft Sustainability Cloud, Net Zero Salesforce Cloud, to the ones you mentioned, Kristi, to Plan A and the likes of that. However, one of the pros is that they might be purpose-built, but they'll sit outside your existing processes. So if you're doing operational processes, sales and operations planning, they'll sit aside from that, even internal management reporting. And they may only operate at a consolidated sort of corporate level. So other organizations go down the route of just using standard technology, what they call business intelligence and enterprise performance management, and developing it themselves, which means they can customize it, but it means that they probably have to build a lot more themselves. Really small organizations might just use Excel. I don't recommend that. It's great for prototyping. It's good to get your head around problems, but it's not really sustainable from an enterprise perspective. And then what I think you'll find as well is that some of the ERP and finance platforms, there's Xero in Australia. I know the SAP have a sustainability footprint management tool, for example, and some of these will be like a system of record. They even include things like cradle to grave calculations. So they've also got a place as well, but they might not support things like the scenario planning or what if analysis. So There was a pretty long answer. I gave a bunch of options there. That's also a topic that we could spend a whole show on, Michael, I think.
All right. Okay. Well, we got lots of themes there. Look, we are out of time, but we have got 2 more questions, which I really want to deal with. So I'm going to ask you to give me a very, very, very brief answer to these final 2 questions. We've had a question from Scott. Scott Severite. I'm finding that businesses will adopt a wait-and-see approach to ESG without clarity as to requirements. If I were a multinational organization, I would be overwhelmed by the complexity and variance across reporting. Is the biggest delay to action coming from evolving standards? Very quick reply, either of you.
It definitely has been a barrier, yes. And I think that there's a lot of really smart people working on harmonizing these standards, and the ISSB wasn't created from scratch. It combines TFCD, SASPA, and other standards. So definitely it's been an issue. A lot of people recognize that. And we are seeing more and more harmonization.
Okay. Kristi, anything to add to that?
No, I just completely agree with what David has said.
Great, thank you. Last question from Ray Edgar, whom somebody I spoke to a few days ago, and who'll be appearing on the show in February with a very interesting plan. Is this an audit reporting problem for CFOs down or doing sustainability challenge identity for what businesses actually mean in society now? So is this an audit reporting problem? What do you think? Very briefly, I'm sorry to say to you.
I mean, I'll try and keep it short because it depends on your interpretation of the question, really. But I mean, it's not at all. I think the whole point of, say, ISSB, yes, it looks like it's measuring and reporting, but it's to enable investors to make better decisions, to get capital flows, because that's what we really need, is money flowing to decarbonization and things like that. So yeah, it might start like that as a compliance issue, but that's how a lot of stuff starts in organizations. But eventually it's going to drive capital and hopefully drive a cultural change in organizations, a way they review sort of risk and opportunity.
Okay, thank you for that. Kristi?
And to touch on what David said, it is one of the objectives of the ISSB standard is to have the free flow of capital to get to these businesses who do make an positive environmental impact, and for investors to put, to make these solid decisions on where they feel on an individual level to make their impact as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Kristi, and thank you for that, David. We are out of time. We have lots of questions that we were planning to deal with, but we're out of time to deal with them. I've just got one more thing to say. We had a comment from Scott Severite. He said, it's great to be here again and catch up with the tribe of ESG. I wonder what the collective noun is for ESG advocates. And I got a description for people who watch the ESG show. I know what the collective noun to describe people who watch the ESG show is, and that is people with good taste. So thank you all very, very much for watching today. Thank you, Kristi. Thank you, David. And see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.